morning, everyone. My name is Jacina Stanton-Buttram, and welcome to Black Lives Matter Plaza. It is truly a sight to behold. Please stand and remove your hats for the invocation and the presentation of the colors. The colors will be presented by Georgia Eves of the National Alliance for Black Veterans. The invocation will be given by my co-host, Michael Mack, and Major Pete Smith of the United States Marine Corps Reserves will sing the national anthem.
Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we call upon you once again to thank you for this glorious day. We thank you for this tremendous opportunity to deliver this message to your people. We pray that this platform, this vehicle that is used to deliver your message of peace, fairness, and equality is received with understanding, tenderness, and fondness. We pray that the deliverers of your message execute it with passion, conviction, and sincerity. Finally, and more importantly, Father, we pray that those who do not recognize the challenges and struggles of individuals that do not look like them be provided with clarity, sympathy, and empathy. Through this broadcast today, in your holy name, I pray. Amen.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets red, the bombs bursting in air, yeah, moved through the night, that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free, sit in the home of the brave.
The flyover that you just witnessed on the monitor here was provided by the United States Air Force. This year, Captain Rimoshay Nelson became the first female Thunderbird pilot. Captain Nelson is a graduate of Howard University and received her commission through the Howard University's Air Force ROTC program. Please join us in a rousing round of applause for Captain Nelson and the diversity and inclusion that the U.S. Air Force has promulgated.
2 weeks ago, you might remember they flew over our region in spectacular formation.
Well, one of the newest members of the team is a Howard University graduate, and she is making history. Un is here now with her story, a great story. Un?
Aaron, good morning, and Jimmy, good morning to you as well. You know, it's so rewarding in our profession when we meet someone who leaves a lasting impression, and Captain Rimoshay Nelson is an Air Force officer who is a leader in her field and just an inspiration to women, girls, and anyone who aspires to achieve greatness.
When the U.S. Air Force Thunderbirds roared over the skies of Baltimore, Washington, and Atlanta to salute the area's essential workers, a trailblazing officer flew in formation.
So I know there is a small percentage of African-American officers, specifically female officers in the Air Force. So to be in a position that is visible, to show little girls that this is attainable, to let them know that they can do anything that they can put their mind to, is an absolute honor.
Captain Rimoshay Rimoshe Nelson is the first African-American woman to be selected to this elite team as public affairs officer. It was not an easy flight to the top.
Even when people tell you no to your face because who you are, but your work shows where you should be, I think if you continue to work hard and to go after what it is you want, you will achieve your dreams.
This is Captain Nelson's first season with the legendary Demonstration Squadron. With shows on hold for now, the Thunderbirds have honored the heroes on the front line of the pandemic with flyovers around the country.
Where people can look up and have some type of hope during this time and knowing that we will get through this. The Thunderbirds are with them.
Captain Nelson was born in Atlanta and raised in Douglasville, Georgia. Her parents, a source of inspiration, had the chance to watch a flyover from their home.
My parents, who definitely come from a low-income family, who did not go to college, they worked extremely hard to give me those opportunities. And I wake up every morning knowing that if I work hard, I continue to make them proud.
Captain Nelson has spent 8 years serving in the Air Force, mostly overseas. But she says the best decision she ever made was attending Howard University.
To be around people who look like me and help, I would say, instill a self-confidence into who I am and be able to walk into the world knowing who I am, where I come from, where my people come from, and where we can go was invaluable.
The values she carries with her in service are steeped in hard work, the drive to be the best she can be and to make a difference in the world.
We have one life to live. And so I want to do that by giving back, by showing other people what's possible, and to just achieve as much as I can while I have the opportunity to do so.
I mean, the sky's the limit, right? Captain Nelson says when people give thanks, they should not only remember the healthcare workers who are heroes, but also the grocery store workers, food service, fast food, and sanitation workers as well, who have to go to work every single day. She knows that she not only represents her fellow airmen, but women of color and little girls who have big dreams. What a role model and just a great ambassador for the Air Force. Aaron and Jumi.
That flyover presented during the national anthem was from a NASCAR event. NASCAR announced in June of this year that it would be prohibiting the display of the Confederate flag from all NASCAR events. This is the type of symbolic change that is required to speak to the will of the people who want to see a meaningful change. Let's give NASCAR a round of applause for their commitment to changing the prohibiting of the display of symbols of hate. This is the type of symbolic change that is required to speak to the will of the people who want to see a meaningful change.
Not only is the U.S. Air Force breaking the brass ceiling for women, the Air Force has nominated Charles Q. Brown, Commander, Pacific Air Forces, as the next Chief of the Air Force Staff, making him the first black general to head a military service in our military's 244-year history. Please join us in giving a round of applause for this historic achievement. And here is a brief interview from General Brown sharing his personal challenges on race and advancing through the ranks.
As the Commander of Pacific Air Forces, a senior leader in our Air Force, and an African American, many of you may be wondering what I'm thinking about the current events surrounding the tragic death of George Floyd. Here's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about how full I am with emotion, not just for George Floyd, but the many African Americans that have suffered the same fate as George Floyd. I'm thinking about protests in my country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, the equality expressed in our Declaration of Independence and the Constitution that I've sworn my adult life to support and defend. I'm thinking about a history of racial issues and my own experiences that didn't always sing of liberty and equality. I'm thinking about living in two worlds, each with their own perspective and views. I'm thinking about my sister and I being the only African Americans in our entire elementary school and trying to fit in. I'm thinking about then going to a high school where roughly half the students were African American and trying to fit in. I'm thinking about my Air Force career, where I was often the only African American in my squadron, or as a senior officer, the only African American in the room. I'm thinking about wearing the same flight suit with the same wings on my chest as my peers, and then being questioned by another military member, "Are you a pilot?" I'm thinking about how I sometimes felt my comments were perceived to represent the African American perspective, when it's just my perspective informed by being African American. I'm thinking about some of the insensitive comments made without awareness by others. I'm thinking about being a captain at the Oak Club with my squadron and being told by other African Americans that I wasn't black enough since I was spending more time with my squadron than with them. I'm thinking about my mentors and how rarely I had a mentor that looked like me. I'm thinking about the sound advice that has led to my success, and even so, most of my mentors could not relate to my experience as an African American. I'm thinking about the pressure I felt to perform error-free, especially for supervisors I perceived had expected less from me as an African American. I'm thinking about having to represent by working twice as hard to prove their expectations and perceptions of African Americans were invalid. I'm thinking about the airmen that have lived through similar experiences and feelings as mine, or who were either consciously or unconsciously unfairly treated. Conversely, I'm thinking about the airmen who don't have a life similar to mine and don't have to navigate through two worlds. I'm thinking about how these airmen view racism, whether they don't see it as a problem since it doesn't happen to them, or whether they're empathetic. I'm thinking about our two sons. Now we had to prepare them to live in two worlds. I'm thinking about the frank and emotional conversations my wife and I have had with them just this past week as we discussed the situations that have led to the protests around our country. Finally, I'm thinking about my historic nomination to be the first African American to serve as the Air Force Chief of Staff. I'm thinking about the African Americans that went before me to make this opportunity possible. I'm thinking about the immense expectations that come with this historic nomination, particularly through the lens of current events plaguing our nation. I'm thinking about how I may have fallen short in my career and will likely continue falling short living up to all those expectations. I'm thinking about how my nomination provides some hope, but also comes with a heavy burden. I can't fix centuries of racism in our country, nor can I fix decades of discrimination that may have impacted members of our Air Force. I'm thinking about how I can make improvements, personally, professionally, and institutionally, so that all airmen, both today and tomorrow, appreciate the value of diversity and can serve in an environment where they can reach their full potential. I think I don't have all the answers on how to create such an environment, whether here in PACAF or across our Air Force. I'm thinking about, without clear-cut answers, I just want to have the wisdom and knowledge to lead during difficult times like these. I want the wisdom and knowledge to lead, participate in, and listen to necessary conversations on racism, diversity, and inclusion. I want the wisdom and knowledge to lead those willing to take committed and sustained action to make our Air Force better. That's what I'm thinking about. I want to know what you're thinking about. I want to hear what you're thinking about and how together we can make a difference.
As the youngest of the four major armed services, the Air Force has traditionally been on the leading edge of innovation and inclusion, dating back to the famed Tuskegee Airmen, Red Tails, 332nd Pursuit Squadron. Let's give the Air Force a round of applause for leading and innovation and inclusion.
At this time, ladies and gentlemen, we will move to the formal part of our program. I have the pleasure to introduce our first speaker, the founder of Citizens Against Intolerance, Mr. Troy Mosley.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. As Jacina stated, my name is Troy Mosley. I'm a second-generation Army officer. My father is a Vietnam veteran, and I am a veteran of the Iraq War. We are both graduates of Florida A&M University, a historically black college, or HBCU. We are both grateful to our nation for the outstanding opportunities our service in uniform has provided us. We are grateful for being able to represent the greatest nation in the world in uniform. My grandfather was a sharecropper. He was never allowed to reach his full potential The stifling oppression under which he grew up prevented him from reaching to the stars, prevented him from being all that he could be based on what was in his mind and his heart. He was one of millions of casualties of America's structural racial inequality, which persisted since the nation was founded well into today. America and the military have come a long way, but there is still work to be done. The work is evident in the 2019 West Point graduating class. A class of 1,000 cadets contained 34 women, the most ever to graduate from West Point since the Academy began to accept women in 1976. The second largest number of female graduates, 234. The largest number of Latino Americans, 88. The 1,000th Jewish cadet ever. These achievements didn't happen by accident or roll in on wheels of inevitability. They were the result of a concerted effort by former Army Chief of Staff Odierno. General Odierno. It was a deliberate act on the point of West Point to reach out to look for diverse of this diverse group of leaders represents a capability that is the wellspring of diversity within our nation. This potential, if not developed, is only potential. That is the challenge before us today. The great irony is that these lieutenants will serve at bases named for Confederates, men who betrayed their oath to God and country and killed hundreds of thousands in order to preserve slavery and a belief in racial supremacy. I started Citizens Against Intolerance with a group of friends a little over 2 years ago to advance the plight of the military and America on issues of inclusion. Our vision is to create a society where no one's potential is limited by bias. I can also tell you, as a black man growing up in the late 1960s, there are few instances I can recall where my experiences were not marred by race or racism. And for many people of color, that is the rule and not the exception. We are here today to foot stomp the need for change that supports greater structural equality in all its forms. Today, we still pay homage to men who are on the wrong side of history. Inexplicably, we have found a way to honor men at the height of their malfeasance, men who betrayed their oath to protect and defend the United States Constitution in order to preserve American chattel slavery. These 12 U.S. Army taxpayer bases were built between 1917 and 1942. At that time, 90% of all black Americans lived in the Deep South under a system of de jure segregation, also known as Jim Crow. They had no say, they had no voice in politics, but rest assured their tax dollars were used to construct these bases. They were forced to participate in their own subjugation. We call this taxation without representation, and that's one of the fundamentals that our country was founded against. Before we can atone, many people within our nation want forgiveness for these sins. But before there can be forgiveness, there must be a repenting for the wrongs. Until we as a nation have this reckoning, we will always struggle with the issues of America's original sin. They say that history does not repeat, but it rhymes. To borrow vernacular from my 3 adult children, history is spitting bars at us right now. How will we respond? What will we tell our children that we did in this moment? Are we going to be moved to action, or will we sit idly and let this moment pass us by? The novel coronavirus has eliminated the distractions of the daily rat race and exposed the results of hundreds of years of structural racial inequality. The murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, and Sean Monterosa in this moment have touched off protests around the world. The world's citizens know that racial inequality is one of the greatest existential threats to our America's representative form of democracy. Americans and people across the world want to see this experiment succeed because the world knows that America is the world's greatest hope for a society that values all humanity equally. We understand the palpable frustrations of those who want to see change brought about yesterday. We share your frustration, but I would submit that toppling statues is not only the wrong thing to do and is dangerous, but we can do better. Real change, lasting change, requires more resolve and more determination. Martin Luther King Jr. reminded of this in his letter from a Birmingham jail, just how difficult change is. Dr. King, in speaking to a group of clergy that were urging him to be patient and wait for change, had this to say: "It is the strangely irrational notion that there is something in the very flow of time that will cure all ills. Time is neutral. It can be used either destructively or constructively. I am coming to feel that the people of ill will have used time more effectively. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the actions of the people of ill will, but for the silence of the good people. We must come to see that human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. Progress through the tireless efforts of persistent work of men and women of good conscience, willing to roll up their sleeves and ally with God to do the hard work that is necessary to bring about lasting change. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of those who wish to preserve social stagnation." So, my challenge to you today: are you registered to vote? If you are registered to vote and vote habitually, are you registered to be a poll observer? We're taking the baton from that generation who marched in the 60s, the John Lewises of the world. And it is now for another generation to step up, to step forward, to be present, to be visible, to endure the challenges of the coronavirus to ensure that the voice of democracy is not subjugated. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for gathering today to participate in our inaugural rally to honor our heroes. 72 years ago today, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, which desegregated the armed forces and cast our military as unlikely champions for inclusion and true equality of opportunity. The President's executive order was one of the most sweeping pieces of executive authority of all time. It was the first federally sanctioned rebuke of the belief in white supremacy. Since the Reconstruction era, what many people may not know is Harry Truman signed the executive order partly in response to the atrocities committed against black and brown service members reintegrating into American society following World War II. While white soldiers were receiving welcome home parades in New York City and all over, black soldiers, especially in the South, with their mercenary Jim Crow laws, were being treated as second-rate citizens after fighting and some dying for their country. 3/4 of a century later, Black Americans and athletes peacefully protesting police brutality against citizens of color is still somehow controversial today. So far as America has come on issues regarding racial equality, there is yet again still work to be done. To raise public awareness of the aforementioned work and truly galvanize us, all of us, to turn out en masse on November 3rd to voice our thoughts at the ballot box. We're putting on an incredible program today to capture the energy of this moment and channel it toward voter turnout. We need you to turn out.
Now, prior to signing the executive order, President Truman appointed the nation's first committee on civil rights to study the problem of equal protection under the law, which was still not a reality for over 90% of Black Americans who lived in the South. President Truman's Committee on Civil Rights was comprised of some of the nation's best economists, academians, historians, and industry leaders. The board was chaired by Charles Edward Wilson, CEO of General Electric. You can see him on the screen. And 2 females, Dorothy Rogers Tilley and Sadie Tanner Moselle Alexander, who was the first female to receive a PhD in economics and also the first female to receive a law degree from the University of Pennsylvania and the first woman to practice law in the state of Pennsylvania. And I actually attended law school in Pennsylvania, so that means a great deal to me.
The committee was progressive and revolutionary in every respect. On October 29, 1947, the committee produced an explosive 178-page report entitled "To Secure the..."
The report proposed to establish a permanent Civil Rights Commission, Joint Congressional Committee on Civil Rights, and a Civil Rights Division in the Department of Justice, a requirement to develop federal protection from lynching, and a permanent Fair Employment Practice Commission, an absolution of poll taxes, and a federal law against police brutality.
The report to secure these rights would become the cornerstone of what we know today as the modern civil rights movement, and it would reach its apex some 20 years later with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, spearheaded by the Honorable Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Practically all the measures contained in the report were eventually adopted, except for 2, a federal law against lynching and a federal law against police brutality. Now, it's noteworthy to recognize that our country knew in 1948 that many of our nation's police forces had been co-opted by men to support an unconstitutional caste system. We are still struggling with issues of police violence perpetrated against unarmed, often innocent, Black and brown citizens. And we didn't have the political will then to address that specific issue, but we must find the resolve in this moment to do better with the Federal Anti-Lynching Protection Act, and also as the House of Representatives passed a measure this year which stalled in the U.S. Senate, unfortunately because there was an objection by one of the senators for the definition of lynching.
The U.S. Senate formally apologized in 2005 for failing to outlaw the practice of lynching, and long ago adopted other measures to make racially motivated killings federal crimes. The NAACP's Crisis magazine reported on all lynching in the United States until 1968, when the practice finally ceased to become commonplace. From 1882 through 1968, 4,743 lynchings occurred in the United States. Of these people that were lynched, 3,446 were black. The black people who were lynched accounted for 72.7% of the people lynched. These numbers seem large, but it is known that not all of the lynchings were recorded. Out of the 4,743 people lynched, 1,297 white people were lynched, 27.3%. Many of the white Americans were lynched for helping black citizens or refusing to support the Jim Crow caste system. When the black and brown veterans of World War II returned home from victory in Europe and the Pacific, violent clashes ensued all across America, of which lynching was a central feature of intimidation. And these men who had come face to face with fascist enemies were now face to face with sweltering and immoral subjugation that existed at the time from their own fellow citizens.
Coercive and violent means were used to deter black and brown veterans reintegrating into society from believing that they would win any of their liberties at home that they secured for others abroad. These violent measures were often meted out by police to deny black and brown citizens their full rights and privileges under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution.
Two incidents in particular, the blinding of Sergeant Isaac Woodard and the quadruple murder of George and Mae Dorsey and Roger and Dorothy Malcolm, moved Truman to action. These two incidents shook Truman to his core and compelled him to use the full weight and authority of the office of the presidency to chip away at the stifling oppression of Jim Crow laws. The Southern sociopath political structure of that time was enshrouded in a racially based caste system that made black and brown Americans permanent second-class citizens with no hope of attaining any mainstream social, cultural, or political life, or from achieving any form of systematic upward mobility.
Truman was pushed by everyday Americans like you and I, and the Black Free Press, to make good on America's promise for freedom for all citizens. But Truman didn't believe in social equality. But he knew that black and brown Americans were not getting a fair deal. And he wanted to refashion our democracy into a role model system of governance that would be shopped around a war-torn world, and it would be something to emulate.
Thankfully, the United States and our military have come a long way from those days, and we are here today through hard work, civic activism, and by the grace of God to celebrate that progress.
However, we would be naive to believe that all is well here within the nation. Despite our progress, we are still each and every day confronted with glaring racial inequities in policing, housing, education, health, home ownership, and other things. Virtually every American institution is still affected by structural racism, as evidenced by the disproportionate numbers of black and brown citizens that were affected by the coronavirus, and also by the tragic killings of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Sean Monterosa, who was shot by police in California while kneeling with his hands up.
As it always has been and always will be, our military is a subset of America. The problems which plague our country impact our armed services too. as we ebb and flow on that constant myriad of social issues, our institutions must be the gatekeepers of the values that undergird our society. Most paramount among them are these values is that all people are created equal and therefore should be treated as equal.
One tragedy, which you may be less familiar with, was a tragic murder of Army Second Lieutenant Richard Collins III, who has been posthumously promoted to First Lieutenant by the United States Army.
The lieutenant was murdered on the University of Maryland's campus following a night of celebration with his friends in anticipation of his graduation that was to have taken place the following week. Here today to tell his story are his mother and his father, Don and Richard Collins Jr., founders of the Second Lieutenant Richard Collins III Foundation for Social Justice.
Good afternoon. First, we'd like to take a moment to thank Mr. Troy Mosley for granting us the opportunity to speak with you today. We'd also like to thank Mr. Carl Snowden for his gracious recommendation that allows us to stand before you. We are honored to be here for the 72nd anniversary of Executive Officer 9981, which desegregated the U.S. Armed Forces. Our family comes from a long tradition of service to this country. My father was in the Army and fought in the Korean War. I served in the Navy and fought during the Vietnam War. Our son joined the Bowie State University ROTC program because he felt called to serve his country.
I grew up as the proud daughter of a dedicated New York City police officer and served alongside my husband as a Navy spouse, which I deem one of the hardest jobs in the military. So witnessing our son taking the oath of office as a second lieutenant in the United States Army was one of the happiest days of my life. It was Richard's dream to serve his country, and he hoped to be a general one day. We were so proud of his decision to pursue a career of personal sacrifice to defend our nation and the values we stand for.
But sadly, just as quickly as our son's dream were being realized, his future was cut short and taken from him. Richard was murdered on the campus of the University of Maryland at College Park, just days after he had sworn into the U.S. Army, and before he could get the opportunity to walk across the graduation stage to receive his diploma from Bowie State University. His killer, a white man who my son had never met, was a follower of an alt-right white supremacist group on social media. The cell phone possessed when he was arrested contained viciously racist images. A surveillance video of the night that changed our lives also shows a white man and Asian woman standing next to Richard. But our son was the only one attacked and targeted. The killer let the others who were standing near him walk away unharmed.
Having a window into the character of our son's murderer, you can imagine our shock and horror when the judge chose to dismiss the hate crime charges against them. We couldn't believe that Maryland's standard for prosecuting a hate crime was so high that our son's murder was not seen for what it was. The evidence presented at the trial left no doubt in our minds that Richard was targeted because of the color of his skin and the apparent hatred in his killer's heart. The judge's decision had us in that same fog of disbelief as the awful moment when 2 Maryland state troopers showed up at our house to tell us that Richard had been murdered. Our son's life was devalued a second time, but this time in the very courtroom that was supposed to deliver him justice.
Unfortunately, our story is now part of a narrative that weaves our family history into American history in a way that we never imagined possible. We believed this country was moving us toward progress, but our reality was shattered by the murder of our son. Our son's grandfather, my father, stood in combat in the Korean War, but couldn't survive the scourge himself of American racism. Some 62 years before Richard was murdered, and just after returning home from the Korean War, my father was also murdered by a white man, motivated by hatred for a stranger of a different skin color, and in a southern town that never cared to bring my father's killer to justice.
The law has failed our family over and over again. And our tragedy is too familiar a tale for other families. So many innocent lives have been lost due to hate-motivated crimes at the hands of extremists. We care about this country as much as we always have. And for that reason, we feel a responsibility to use the perspective that we gained in the midst of our tragedy to not just advocate for improvements to the law as we've done in Maryland, but to encourage individual citizens to recognize the importance of exercising their right to vote. If our journey has taught us anything, it is the significance of having elected officials who are conscientious about the impact of our laws on people of color and other marginalized groups.
We need states throughout the country to enact legislation such as the Second Lieutenant Richard W. Collins III hate crime law that was passed this year in the Maryland State Legislature. This law, named in honor of our son, now equips states prosecutors with the tools necessary to successfully prosecute and convict perpetrators of hate-related crimes. We feel fortunate that Prince George's County State's Attorney, Aisha Braveboy, stood shoulder to shoulder with us in the fight to remove this unsatisfactory status quo. We need leaders that will stand against the senseless targeting of minorities and people of color with violence and fight the laws that continue to keep us in a situation where we're combating hate. Not only that, but to work to dismantle an entire system that disadvantages people of color in this country. But neither of those things can happen without action from you. We must demand a better society for all and humbly recognize that if hate is still claiming the lives of patriotic citizens, that we've got our work cut out for us. My wife and I are committed to civic action to help bring healing to deep societal wounds through the foundation we have created in memory of our son. Our foundation, the Second Lieutenant Richard W. Collins III Foundation, stands as a reminder of our son's bright light that was prematurely extinguished because of racism, and of the ongoing sacrifices of black and brown people for the country that they love.
In honor of our son, Second Lieutenant Richard W. Collins III, we hope that one day we'll finally see a country that loves those same black and brown people in return. We will never, ever forget our son, Lieutenant Collins. We ask that you reflect on what it means for all people if given a model citizen like our son, and it doesn't protect him, where are we? One of the last statements my son made to me on the day of his commissioning was, "Mom, the world will know my name." We're hard at work to make sure that statement rings true. But today I ask, I beseech, that you simply remember his name among other names and be an ambassador for our cause. Help us shine a light on the work that needs to be done to rid our society of hate and all of the men and women in uniform by doing your duty as a citizen, committing to vote in all elections, whether it's local or national. In closing, we ask that each of you remember the name of Second Lieutenant Richard W. Collins III. Blessings.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Last Sunday, July 19th, America mourned the loss of Congressman John Lewis, as well as Reverend C.T. Vivian, and most recently, Charlie Evers, the younger brother of Medgar Evers. Now, this cohort was the latest of a group of a great tradition of civil rights stalwarts that have departed this earth. But today, we have the privilege of hearing from our own regional stalwart, Mr. Carl Snowden. Carl is a part of the second generation of civil rights champions that followed on the heels of Congressman Lewis. And I want to tell you a little bit about him. His first foray into the civil rights struggle was at Annapolis High School in 1970, when he and 4 other students were expelled simply because they wanted to have an African American studies course and more African Americans teachers. And so he then went to private school at the Key School, and he began his foray into politics. He later became an alderman and is now the president of the Caucus of African American Leaders. That's Carl's beginning, and he's been getting into good trouble ever since. And I also want to tell you a personal anecdote about that story. I'm a graduate of Annapolis High School, and 25 years after Carl Snowden and the 4 students were expelled, I actually took African American studies at Annapolis High School. And I took them from 2 African American male teachers. So Mr. Snowden had a direct impact on my life, and I thank him for that and all the good work he's done. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Carl Snowden.
Let me, before beginning, pause just for a moment. I want to really speak to the young people that's gathered here, and I'm so glad that Richard and Dawn brought a group of young people, because your generation, you're the new leaders that must lead. I want to take a moment and ask people for a moment of silence. Remember, a moment of silence for John Lewis, the Reverend C.T. Vivian, and yes, Lieutenant Richard Collins. We can just take a moment of silence. Thank you. We are at blocks from the White House. We're at an area that has now been called Black Lives Matter Plaza. Before getting into my remarks, I want to take a moment to thank Troy Mosley. Troy has made it possible for us to be here. He has raised the question whether or not we should be honoring people who are traitors to the country. He has raised the question, what will our nation be? We'll take the moment to recognize a few of our former and present elected officials. Our delegate Mike Rogers is with us from the Maryland General Assembly. Former delegate Clarence Taggart Davis, personal friend of mine, who's also from the Maryland General Assembly, and Councilman Pete Smith, who was from Anne Arundel County. And we have people who served in the service that's here that I would like to acknowledge. Louis Bracey, who served in the Army, Jeff Henderson, who served in the Marine Corps, and others who've come to participate in today's event. To the master, he who put wetness in water. To the master, he who put blue in the sky and allows birds to fly. To the master, he who brings us here at this moment, at this hour, to look at where America is. To the master, who we come and humble ourselves and honor this afternoon. We're here to celebrate an anniversary. Celebrate the fact that 72 years ago, as has been noted, a sitting president made the determination that we need to desegregate. We need to desegregate the armed forces. But history is a funny thing. If you don't know your history, you'll wind up giving credit to the wrong person. It is true that President Harry Truman desegregated the armed forces. But what Americans need to know, there was a tall African-American man by the name of A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph told the nation, we will bring hundreds, thousands of black people to march on Washington unless you integrate the armed services. It was the threat of Americans of color coming to Washington, D.C. that had a vacillating president by the name of Harry Truman changed his mind and desegregated armed services. Men and women who served in the armed services know that it's a rich experience, but it's not one that has not been with us. My father served in the Korean War, Brother Richard. But my father served at a strange time in American history. When I was growing up, my father had one eye, and I thought that my father had lost his eye during the war. And for some reason, we never asked my father, how did you lose your eye? When my father died, we were taking him to Crownsville Veterans Cemetery, where they bury people. Brother Alfonso, at that time, I turned to my uncle and I said to my uncle, how did my father lose his eye during the war? And my Uncle Joe responded, he didn't lose his eye during the war. I said, well, did he lose his eye after the war? He said, no. He lost his eye before he went in the service. I didn't know somebody could go into service with one eye. But at that time, the need for American soldiers was so great that those who had disabilities were allowed to go in. And my father, interesting enough, became a sharpshooter. My father served his time in the service. Years later, I would learn that my father lost his eye because America, under another president, had a program called the CCC. It was a program designed to take unemployed Americans and put them back to work. And in those days, black people got the worst jobs. So my father's job was to explode boulders to make way for highways and streets. And a splinter from the boulder hit him in the eye and he lost it. And my father never told how he lost his eye. My father never talked about war. He never talked about what it was like to go abroad to fight fascism and to come home and deal with racism. Today marks 100 days before the election of a new president will take place in America. We're in a perilous time. I was talking to Delegate Davis before this meeting got started. I hope Americans understand where we are. We're at a crossroads. Martin King, when he died in 1968, told the nation there are some dark days ahead of us, and we've reached that dark day. Americans must make a decision. What type of nation do we want? Americans must decide whether we want an America that is all-inclusive or an America that's divided. The truth of the matter is America cannot survive divided. The truth of the matter is that, as Fannie Lou Hamer said so eloquently, everybody's going to be free or nobody's going to be free. That's the America that we're in. That's the reality of the day that we are in. We're at a time now where every American must decide for themselves. What type of president do they want? What type of Senate do they want? What type of House of Representatives do they want? The President of the United States has publicly announced that he supports keeping monuments named after Confederate soldiers. The truth of the matter is those Confederate soldiers were traitors. They committed treason. And the fact of the matter is that America has decided whether they want to put behind us that history. We're now at this point, with 100 days to go, where we have to make some decisions. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, and I would add women, are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. The right to liberty, the right to pursue happiness. And that's where I want to stop. Something was said earlier today that I know it's easy for people to miss. And I'm underscoring it for a particular reason. Sometimes people don't feel other people's pain. My mother lived to be almost 105 years old. She just passed but a month ago. I know what pain is. I know what it is to lose a loved one. I know people who told me at the passing of my mother, I know how you feel. No, you don't. You can only imagine. My mother lived to be almost 105. She was born when women didn't have the right to vote. My mother grew up in an apartheid system called segregation in America. My mother saw many things in her life. My mother was part of a generation of people who believed in America and believed in it deeply and greatly. I want to share this experience with you. And I want young people to hear this and hear it well as I move to my conclusion. When I was a little boy, 5 or 6, no more than that, I lived on a farm in a place called Davidsonville, Maryland. I lived with my grandfather on his farm with our extended family. We used to play in the woods. And in these woods, we could take sticks, put it between our legs, and imagine that it was a horse. In our woods, we could take a twig and turn it into a space gun or a 6-shooter. In our woods, with our imagination, we had the ability to climb trees and pretend that we were on spaceships. And my best friend was a little boy named Tommy. Tommy and I loved each other. We were inseparable. But Tommy loved somebody greater than me. He loved his father. His father was a man named Mr. Marshall. Mr. Marshall was a tall black man, but 6'6". He was a sharecropper. I didn't know what a sharecropper was. But Tommy and I would watch his father as his father put this plow on his back and plowed up the field. We watched Tommy's father take a calf and lift it up on his back. We saw Tommy's father cut trees down and make wood. Tommy used to look at his father with such great pride and admiration. Tommy loved his father. His father was the kind of man that didn't say a lot, but when he spoke, you listened. He had a commanding presence. Tommy one day said to me, "My father is so strong, he can beat Superman." And if there was ever anybody that could beat Superman, secretly I thought it was Tommy's father. Tommy at one point was so proud of his father, he looked me in the eye without making any contradiction and saying, "My father can beat your father." I didn't debate it with him. I saw how strong Tommy's father was. One day, Tommy and I were playing as we usually do. It was an August day, one of those sweltering days, those days that you have to be barefooted, those days that you don't wear a t-shirt, those days that you just enjoy life. 6 or 7, we were running around playing. All of a sudden, the man that Tommy's father worked for started from what was called the big house, headed toward Tommy's house. We saw something in this man. We saw the anger. He looked like he was mad. We didn't know why, but we wanted to know. In those days, kids were not allowed to get into adult business, but Tommy and I was curious. Why is this man walking this way? Why is he so angry? So Tommy and I ran ahead of him, found some bushes, and we hid in the bushes so we could observe what was going on without being seen. This man, who happened to be white, got down to Tommy's father's house. He banged on Tommy's father's door. Tommy's mother answered the door, and he asked, where was Marshall? Tommy's mother answered, he's sick. He can't come to work today. The man pushed his way in. There was a cacophony of sound. It sounded like it was forever, but it was just a few moments. Out of the house walked Tommy's father. He had no shoes on, no shirt on. Behind him was his boss. And his boss was saying to him, "Nigger, if you don't come to work today, I want you off of my land, off of my property." And Tommy's father turned around to say something, and the man shoved Tommy's father, catching him off guard, and as Tommy's father hit the dust, this man spat upon Tommy. He was chewing tobacco. In those days, people chewed tobacco, and he spit upon Tommy's father. For me, the world came to a moment. It just halted. You see, I had seen Tommy's father. I knew his power. I saw his biceps. I saw a man, and his strength didn't come from lifting weights, came from hard work. His vocation and avocation was the same. I was looking for Tommy's father to get up and strike this man who had just humiliated him in front of his wife, his son, and his son's best friend. I looked at this man waiting for him to respond. And Tommy's father did something I have never forgotten. Even as I retell this story to you today, I will never forget it. Tommy's father looked up and said to the man, "Don't fire me, boss. As I coming to work, let me come to work." And the man said to Tommy's father, who was still laying in that dust, "You get on up here, boy. You get on, come on up here and go to work." And he started walking back toward the big house. And Tommy's father, who was still laying down, suddenly got up. And as Tommy's father was getting out of that dirt, he looked at the bushes where Tommy and I was hiding. And he saw his son. His son was crying profusely. And so was I. Tommy's father never said a word to his son. He just got up and started walking toward the big house. Tommy took off running, and to this day, I don't know where Tommy went. But I went home. And I tried to tell my mother at 5 or 6 what I had just seen. And my mother was that generation that believed. She didn't want me to be bitter. She wanted me to be better. So she tried to console me and try to tell me what I'd seen I hadn't seen. But I know what I saw. I saw more than the humiliation of a man in front of his son and his wife. I saw the emasculation of a man and his manhood. I knew as a young boy witnessing that, I said to myself, I'll never let nobody do that to me. Later I would expand it to others. Now those of you in the audience and those of you who are old enough, you can go ahead and justify it. You can say to me, well, Carl, you know, in those days, there wasn't many options for black folks. In those days, men had to take certain imperfections and take certain insults. They had to have their manhood injured because they had to raise their families. You would say that you got to understand the time in which they lived. But little boys at 5 and 6, they don't understand sociology. They don't understand psychology. They know but their mothers and their fathers. Tommy's father never again told me that his father was stronger than mine. There was something that happened to Mr. Marshall as well. That man that used to walk with such a commanding presence. The man that used to have the glint in his eye, it was gone. Something happened on that day that changed him and his relationship with his son forever. I want y'all to hear something. I want you to underscore something. When Dawn and Richard talks about their son that they raised with great expectation, a son that they had great hopes for, great aspirations for. It's not enough just to say, we're so sorry for your loss. The loss of their son represents the loss of sons and daughters all over America. Know your history. Young people, never let anybody tell you that the first time the words, "I can't breathe," was uttered, that it was uttered by a man named Eric Gardner in New York or by George Floyd in Minneapolis. No, that's not the first time the words, "I can't breathe," was uttered. First time the words were breathed, the first time those words were said were when Africans were in this cargo ship, packed like sardines, didn't speak English, so in languages that covered the continent of Africa, mostly West Africa, they said, "I can't breathe." That's been part of the problem with America today. We can't breathe. Go to New York City and look at that statue, Statue of Liberty. Give me your huddled masses waiting to breathe. Well, black people have been here now for 400 years. I moved to this conclusion simply by saying this. President Barack Obama and every African-American person in this country, when asked the question that I'm going to raise this afternoon, all said the same thing. And here it is. If your teenage son or daughter are stopped at midnight, whether it's in Philadelphia, Mississippi, or Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, or Washington, D.C., or Annapolis, Maryland, and a police officer insults them, calls them out of their names, what do you advise your children to do? And Barack Obama and every other father and mother said the same thing. If the man says to you, "Shut your mouth," shut up, they tell him don't say a word. They say it because they love him. They say it because they know about Michael Brown. They know about Sandra Bland. They know about the countless others who have died at the hands of police. And they just want their sons and daughters to come home. And for those of you who are parents, you may believe that that's sage advice. That's good counsel. I'm here to differ with you. And here's why. If you go back 100 years ago, 4 years after my mother was born in 1920, and that same scenario that I just described to you happened, black parents were telling their children, "Keep your mouth shut, survive." Go back to 1820. Black parents were telling their children, "Keep your mouth shut. We want to survive." Go back to 1720. The same thing. In fact, when African Americans arrived in 1619 in this country, we've been saying to our children, "Keep your mouth shut. We want you to survive." Well, my friends, that is the wrong advice. We must see what our young people are saying. No more silence. No more "yes, sir." No more "yes, boss." No more "you going to treat us any way you want to treat us." No more "we going to fight your wars around the world. We'll come back home and be disrespected." No more of that. No more begging for what should be rightfully ours. If you really want to honor Richard Collins, if you want to honor John Lewis, if you want to honor the heroes, honor them by remembering in November to march. Martin Luther King Jr. once said the greatest march that an American can participate in a democracy is the march to the ballot box. There's a man sitting at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, moments from here, who need to understand this is a new America. There's a new people with a new vision, people who are determined to be free. No more "yes, boss." No more "we gonna just get along." No more taking it like it used to be. We're ready to go into a new century, a new decade with a new vision. Martin Luther King Jr. put it this way. John Lewis put it another way, but it means the same thing. Dr. King said, if you can't run, walk. If you can't walk, crawl. But for God's sake, keep the movement moving. A luta continua, which means the struggle continues. God bless.
America and its military enjoy a symbiotic relationship that is as old as the nation itself. Our military draws its legitimacy from the American people and is comprised of the American people.
Communities all over the nation give this country their sons and daughters in hopes that the military will instill the smart order and discipline that has made it the envy of this world.
In exchange, our armed services promises to train, equip, and protect our nation's most precious resources, its people, and only place them in harm's way when it is our collective national interests that are truly at stake.
Whether you are from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, the vast mountains of New York, or the mighty Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, you get the same training, the same equipment, the same food, the same pay, and the same opportunity to protect and defend the Constitution and the nation's values. This is a sacred trust and as old as the nation itself.
It is the shared sense of sacrifice and responsibility that gives our military the potential to be America's greatest meritocracy and an institution where all men are treated equal in shared values, performance, drives, opportunity. This is a special contract between America and its citizens that is the foundational building block of our democracy. When this implied trust breaks down, when performance is not rewarded appropriately, and the sacrifice is not shared equally, morale, performance, and effectiveness all suffer. The troops know when performance is being rewarded. It reflects in their willingness to serve.
Similarly, in America, when our citizens are not treated equally under the law, and when the burdens of society weigh more heavily on certain communities, and the fruits of democracy are distributed more liberally in another, our society suffers. America has its foundation on its original sin, American chattel slavery. The institution of slavery helped to make America a global superpower faster than any other nation in the world. Very early on, minority communities understood that one of the strongest arguments that they could articulate was for full inclusion in America's democratic republic and to serve our country in uniform and join the fight for democracy. And its black and brown citizens have fought and died in every American war that it has ever engaged in. Crispus Attucks, a man believed to be of Native and African ancestry, became the first American believed to have been killed in the American Revolution during the Boston Massacre.
During the American Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, signed by President Abraham Lincoln, freed all enslaved Africans in the slave-holding Confederate States. Over 299,000 black Americans fought during the Civil War to help preserve the Union and secure freedom for millions of enslaved Africans. All told, 309,222 Americans died in defense of the Union during the Civil War.
Most historians regard Robert E. Lee's surrender at the Appomattox Courthouse as the effective end of the Civil War. But less than a week later, President Lincoln was assassinated, and the nation was denied his vision of post-antebellum America, free from slavery. They were so frightened of Lincoln's vision of a nation without slavery that they conspired and killed him before he could implement a vision of his Reconstruction. Regardless, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution were passed. They made it illegal to own slaves, made the former slaves citizens and their descendants, and lastly, granted them the right to vote, respectively.
The period following the American Civil War, known as Reconstruction, gives us an idea of what America would look like in a world of true and moral racial equality. For the first time in the history of our nation, black men were elected to local and state government. There were a total of 2 senators and 15 U.S. representatives elected during this significant era.
There is a great deal of anger against the newfound freedoms of the former enslaved people through means of terrorism and violence. The Ku Klux Klan was formed. Many members were actually former Confederate soldiers, and their main purpose was to terrorize and intimidate black citizens from seeking real independence, from obtaining any real form of wealth, and achieving socio-political advancement.
President Ulysses S. Grant sent federal troops to enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments all across the South. For the first time in the history of our country, black schools, banks, and businesses flourished. Some 1,500 black Americans were elected to local and state offices, but still, they were pushed back with secret black codes and redlining and vagrancy laws, which sought to approximate the slave-master relationship as close as possible.
The tenuous struggle between the newly formed political insurgency and freed men was ended with the ratification of the 1876 presidential election. Presidential candidate Rutherford B. Hayes offered an end to Reconstruction in exchange for Southern states casting their electoral college votes for him. In exchange, Hayes promised to bring an end to the federal troops who occupied the former Confederate states.
Without the protection of federal troops, once again, the Ku Klux Klan reigned terror among black citizens, which for all intents and purposes forced them into second-class citizenry that would last for almost 100 years. A narrative of the lost Southern cause was being developed and spun across America. Content with this unwritten truth, Northerners returned to the process of industrializing and getting on with their lives.
Our next speaker, retired Army General and Professor Emeritus of History at the United States Military Academy at West Point, Mr. Ty Seigele, holds a PhD in Philosophy and History from The Ohio State University and is the author of numerous books. His most recent effort, entitled A Southerner's Reckoning of the Myth of the Lost Cause, Robert E. Lee and Me, makes him one of the nation's leading experts on the mythology of the lost Southern cause. We are pleased to present to you Professor Emeritus Ty Seigele.
Thank you so much. To Troy and the entire team, this is incredible. I feel so honored to join all of you here today. It's amazing. You have proven that people matter, that passion matters, the facts matter, and we can make our government listen to our people. And I'm honored to be here. We're celebrating the issuance of executive order from President Truman that started the end of segregation in the military. I'm proud of our military And I'm proud that it led the nation toward a more just society. But we must feel uncomfortable about how much the military also fought equality. Uncomfortable about the legacy of slavery and segregation. Uncomfortable about the racism that still pervades the American experience. Today I want to talk to you about one symbol of racism that remains all too visible. The military has dozens and dozens of memorials, post names, street names, monuments, and memorials that honor Confederates, that honor the enemy, that honor treason, that honor men who fought for perpetual slavery. Treason for slavery. That's what you need to remember. Treason for slavery. That is the Confederate legacy. No one who serves America, no one who protects America should live and work at a place named after someone who tried to destroy America. Our military, our Army, our every service should never, ever honor traitors for slavery. And we must change those names now. We must change those names. To understand the issue, though, we should start with the Constitution. The U.S. Constitution is the foundation of my service to the nation. As the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass said, the Constitution is a glorious liberty document. But we did not start our nation based on equality for all people. But our founding documents provide the means to achieve the goal of freedom for all. As someone who served in the uniform for nearly 4 decades, my service starts with the oath. If you have ever served in the U.S. government, you've probably taken the oath. Congress, civil servants, anyone lucky enough to serve our great country takes the oath. I love the oath, and if you don't mind, I'm going to say that oath right now. It's been the guiding principle of my life. I, Ty Sigilly, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties upon which, the office upon which I'm about to enter, so help me God. Here's the thing. That oath was written in 1862 as an anti-Confederate oath. When you're talking the purpose of invasion, it's talking about Confederates. It's an anti-Confederate oath. Why? Because the Confederates broke the Constitution. Everyone who has served since 1862 has taken an anti-Confederate oath. Every senator, representative, civil servant, officer, all take that oath. An oath to the Constitution. So let's look at that Constitution. It lists only one crime in the Constitution. It says that treason shall consist only in levying war against the United States. Who committed treason? The Confederates. No one was convicted of treason after the Civil War, although Robert E. Lee was indicted. But I don't need a conviction to analyze the facts. And here are the facts. Robert E. Lee took an oath for his promotion to colonel barely 3 weeks before he resigned. He abrogated his oath and fought to destroy his country. Did he levy war against the U.S.? Yes. Did he commit treason? Hell yes. It's not as though we're now just discovering that the Confederates were traitors. One West Point grad wrote in 1864, and his message was simple. Treason is treason, he said. After the war, a Confederate superintendent told an audience that Confederate graduates, quote, forgot the flag to follow false gods. Congressman James Garfield, who later became president, said that Lee lifted his sword against the life of his country. Treason. And why did they choose treason? To protect slavery. The southern states seceded to protect and expand human bondage throughout North America, to maintain a system of racial control. The war was fought to maintain white supremacy. Don't believe me? Listen to the Confederates. The Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, quote, and I quote here, said, the Confederacy's foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. The southern states declared their reasons in their ordinances of secession. Mississippi stated, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. Yes, it was treason to preserve slavery. That's what the Confederates stood for. But we didn't name those army posts in 1917, or correction, in the Civil War. We named them in 1917 and 1941, in World War I and World War II. And the names, who do we name them after? It's a mishmash of incompetence, pro-slavery advocates, virulent post-war racists, and war criminals. But they do have a few things in common. First, they committed treason to preserve slavery. And second, they killed U.S. Army soldiers. Here are a couple of examples. Fort Gordon, Georgia, named for John Brown Gordon. He fought like hell for the Confederacy, but he never served in the U.S. Army. After the war, he gave a speech in Charleston, and he said that if African Americans demanded equal rights, he would lead a race war to exterminate black people. He led the Ku Klux Klan, and in 1890 he said, vote for him for governor and he would maintain white supremacy forever. Fort Pickett in Virginia honors George Pickett. After the war, he skedaddled to Canada because he feared prosecution. Why? Because he was a war criminal. He summarily executed 22 U.S. soldiers in front of their families. During World War II, one of our largest training bases was named Camp Forrest in Tennessee, named after Nathan Bedford Forrest. Forrest was a slave trader. He illegally imported Africans for sale in the South. He committed war crimes, massacring black troops at Fort Pillow. After the war, he founded the Ku Klux Klan. Yet we trained 250,000 U.S. troops, including black troops, at Camp Forrest. Luckily, it closed in 1946. So I'm going to tell you about one more, and that's Fort Lee, named after Robert E. Lee. And to me, he's the worst. In 1861, there were 7 U.S. Army colonels from Virginia. 7. Of those 7, 6 stayed in the U.S. Army. Only 1 chose treason. Only 1 left the U.S. Army, and that was Robert E. Lee. And why Lee and only Lee? Because he believed in slavery and because he benefited in slavery more than any other officer in the Army. And Lee was cruel to enslaved people. When he took over the management of 3 plantations in 1857, he left no family unit whole, leasing or selling people, taking children away from their mothers, wives away from their husbands. He ordered the whipping of men and women. And when he was general, his army kidnapped free blacks in Pennsylvania during the Gettysburg campaign. During the Battle of the Crater, his army executed captured black soldiers. Today, our most diverse post, the home of the finest logisticians in the history of the world, train at Fort Lee, named after an enslaver who committed treason wearing Army blue, even though he wore Army blue for more than 30 years. We must change those names now. And the post names are hardly the only things named after Confederates. Dozens of roads, monuments, Reserve and National Guard installations, some of them just over the river, the Potomac River in Virginia. This is an enemy who killed U.S. Army soldiers, an enemy who fought to create a slave republic. So why do we have so many different things named after traitors for slavery? And the answer is a simple one. It's white supremacy. Let me say that again. We honored the enemy to further white supremacy. When we named those bases, we named them after local sensibilities. The Post received their names. When they received their names, the South was a one-party racial police state. That's right, black people had no voice, no vote, no part to play in decisions. Yet black people made up between 1/3 and 1/2 of all the population of those states. Black people did protest the names, but they had no political voice. And it wasn't just Southern segregationists that supported those names. The Army was a white supremacist organization too. Remember that the Army was segregated during that time. From 1925 to 1938, the Army wrote a planning document every year about black manpower. I read them all, and they're all virulently racist. The 1932 plan said, and I'm quoting here, the Negro is lower on the evolutionary scale than whites. The Army did not believe that black people were fully human. The Post names reflect the Army's racism. And reading about the military's racism makes me uncomfortable. Good. We should all be uncomfortable about our history. Today we are finally having a reckoning about what the Confederacy meant, a reckoning on the Confederacy's values, slavery and white supremacy, the values of the segregation era, more white supremacy. We must look at our values as a military, as a nation. Thomas Jefferson wrote the soaring words of the Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But he did not live those words. He held humans in bondage. James Madison wrote in the Constitution's preamble, "We the people," in order to form a more perfect union. Yet he too owned humans. It is our duty to ensure the majestic words on our foundational documents achieve their true meaning for all Americans. Yet racism is the virus in the American dirt, affecting everything and everyone who lives in this country. I love my country. I've dedicated my life to its defense, but we must address America's eternal pandemic, racism. Changing the post names will not end racism in America in one fell swoop, but it's not a bad place to start. No American should have to work at a place named for the enemy, an enemy who abrogated their oath, who killed U.S. Army soldiers, and for what purpose? To create a new nation dedicated to human bondage. And the fix is so easy. We have dozens, hundreds, thousands of American heroes to choose from. Heroes that represent the diversity, the strength, the courage of the American experience. Heroes who fought for this country. And we can do this. Change the names. Change the names. Change the names now. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is the CEO of one of America's oldest and most distinguished civil rights advocacy organization, and also a co-sponsor of today's celebration. Founded in 1929, the League of United Latin American Citizens, or LULAC, is the oldest and most widely respected Hispanic civil rights organization in the United States of America. LULAC was created at a time in our country when Hispanics were denied basic civil rights, despite their contributions to American society. The founders of LULAC created an organization that empowers its members to create and develop opportunities where they are needed most. In 1945, a California LULAC council successfully sued to integrate the Orange County school system, which had been segregated on the grounds that Mexican children were more poorly clothed and mentally inferior to their white counterparts. Additionally, in 1954, LULAC brought another historic landmark case, Hernandez versus the state of Texas, to protest the facts that Mexican Americans had never been called to jury duty in that state. The Supreme Court ruled this exclusion unconstitutional. Most recently, LULAC is protecting the rights of essential workers in meat processing plants on the front lines of those keeping our economy running during COVID-19. Their efforts to identify the assailants involved in the murder of specialist Vanessa Guillen led to the congressional review of the command culture of Fort Hood, Texas. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming to the diocese Ms. Cindy Benavides.
Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. My name is Cindy Benavides, and I serve as the CEO of LULAC. And you see, over 91 years ago, LULAC was created in a time when simply coming together could be considered conspiracy, and our people could be hanged, lynched, and killed without ever being a sense of justice. And we find ourselves 91 years later still protecting and defending the Latino community. Today, in 2020, LULAC should no longer exist, and yet we're as relevant as we were in 1929. Today we stand united with Citizens Against Intolerance. Thank you so much, Troy, for your dedication and your effort to make sure that we rename our military bases. Today we stand united with Richard and Dawn in celebrating your son. Today we stand united with the more than 500,000 foreign-born veterans who have fought for this country. Some have lost their lives. And for folks that did not know this, over 40,000 soldiers are 40 born today. Immigrants play an integral role in America. And you see, before Texas was Texas, Texas was Texas. And before California was California, California was California. And before New Mexico was New Mexico, it was Nuevo Mexico. And before Colorado was Colorado, it was Colorado. Let's remember our history. And let's also remember that words matter, that actions matter, and that we might stand united, together, united, for our people, for our community, because we will no longer be silent. Today I stand here and honor my brother who served in the U.S. Marine and served in Iraq. Today I stand here and honor my cousins who have served all across military branches. Today I stand here and honor veterans who are our heroes. Today I stand here and honor all of our communities because honor must be given to them, even when some don't recognize our history and contribution. The fact is that communities of color have served in all of our military wars, all of them. And there was also a time when women served in the military, when they were not recognized and they were not allowed to serve in the military, and yet we joined the military to protect our country. Today we honor 2nd Lieutenant Richard Collins III. And Dawn and Richard, our heart goes out to you because no parent should ever bear witness to what you have bared witness to. Unfortunately, white supremacy and racism still exist in America today. Today we honor Soldier Vanessa Guillen, for you see, so many of us are Vanessa Guillen. It is unacceptable that today in our military, 3 in 4 individuals do not report harassment, rape, or assault. 3 and 4. It is unacceptable that today, on U.S. soil, in a U.S. military base, one of the safest places in America, our soldiers are being killed. It is unacceptable today that Fort Hood and the U.S. Army took over 2 months to respond back to the plea of a mother of Miss Gloria Guillen. And we stand with her and boycott the Army, knowing that they're not doing enough to protect our children. We stand with communities of color and we demand justice and we demand action. You see, there's so much going in America today. And what our young leaders have taught us is that we cannot stand on the sidelines. What our young leaders have always taught us is that we must mobilize and take action. In America today, we have a federal government who separates children and parents. In America today, we have children in cages as young as 1 year of age. In America today, we have children, parents, and individuals who left persecution to come to America, and yet they're faced with persecution in the land of the free and the home of the brave. And I can't but be reminded of our liberty, our Statue of Liberty and what it says. And we're not living up to those ideals. In America today, we know that unfortunately, more African American men die at the hand of police brutality than any other ethnic race today. And the fact is that for so long, our community has said, I can't breathe. Ya no más, basta. Today we stand united to fight the status quo. And I hope that 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue is paying attention. Because the message that our communities are sending across this entire country is that it's no longer right, nor will we stay silent on the sidelines. Ya no más, basta. We will no longer tolerate racism, discrimination, bias, and white supremacy. We are America, even when you don't recognize us as Americans. Nosotros somos americanos. And I want to just share a quick story because I think this speaks to the values of our country. I was brought to this country at the age of 1, undocumented, by parents, by my really, really strong parents who had the foresight to see that Honduras at that time was turning into the second most violent country in the world with the largest homicide. And what they did for me is that they gave me freedom. And only in America can the child of immigrants, an undocumented child who picked up cans in the street of Los Angeles, who cleaned houses, rise up to be the CEO of the largest and oldest national Latino civil rights organization in the country. Only in America do we see that. And it speaks to the efforts of my parents, of the first dreamers who dreamed a dream bigger than me, who knew that their sacrifices would be worth it. Because not only do I stand here with you, but my brother has also served in the military and fought for this country. Not only that, my cousins have too, and they are immigrants. And here is my ask to you. Please sign the petition to rename the military bases under Citizens Against Intolerance. But my biggest ask to you is that we're only 100 days from Election Day, and our greatest act of disobedience is to vote. Our greatest act to lift up our communities is to vote. Our greatest way to protest what is currently happening in America is to vote. Our greatest way to show up and be heard is to vote. And so I ask all of you, what will you be doing on November 3rd? Voting on November 3rd. Let us remind elected officials that they should be fearful of we the people, porque somos americanos, for we too are America. Let us remind the people that we will be showing up at the voting booth, and not only will we be showing up, but we will be asking others to show up, because we have had enough. We want change. We want people who represent America. We want people who represent our values. We want people to be in the White House who understand what it is to be a person of color. And I end with this, for my organizers in the audience. Who has the power? We have the power. Who has the power? Who has the power? Who has the power? Gracias.
Thank you, Cindy, for that powerful message. Now I'd like to welcome back to the podium my friend and the president of Citizens Against Intolerance, Mr. Troy Mosley.
Thank you, Jacina. Don and Richard Collins, thank you for sharing your passionate, poignant, and moving story. I'm a father of 3 young adult children, and I can only imagine the suffering and the pain that you will endure. That is a life-changing event that no one can ever get over, but I am so grateful to you for sharing your passion and for having the courage to share it with the rest of the world. So thank you very much for that. Carl Snowden, thank you for a passionate history lesson on where our nation has come from and where we need to be headed. General Sigile, thank you very much for informing us the spirit and the intent in which bases named for Confederate officers were intended. Treason for slavery, that's all you need to know right there, and that must change. But lastly, I want to thank Cindy Benavidez, LULAC, the president of LULAC, Domingo Garcia, for partnering with us. Without their support, we couldn't have brought this event to you. And I'm going to be brief in my remarks by saying very, very quickly. The establishment of representative democracy in a multi-ethnic republic does not happen organically. It requires leaders to cultivate and speak to our better angels. Harry Truman understood this. President Truman's Commission on Civil Rights was a winning strategy in 1948, and it is a winning strategy today. America needs another Presidential Commission on Civil Rights. Our best industry leaders, economists, social scientists, historians, physicians, and other academians. We need to come together to bring the change that we all know needs to happen. A person's zip code should not have more impact on their future than what is in their mind and what is in their heart. But today there exists a gap between what we profess in our founding documents and what people of color experience daily. As Cindy pointed out so powerfully, the opportunity exists, but it's not all equal. And we are, as Fannie Lou Hamer said, sick and tired of being sick and tired of being twice as good to get half as much. It is time for us to take Dr. Martin Luther King's dream and fashion it into a regionally specific, risk-stratified action plan with quantitative measures for racial equality. Come on now, come on now. In the wake of the tragic murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and so many others, conversations of the talk have become commonplace in Americans' households. But I'm here to tell you, as a father of color, that conversation is one of about 12 conversations that we have with our children. For me, one of the most painful of these conversations I call the awakening moment. It is that moment that you realize, as a person of color, the world sees you differently. It is that moment that you realize, because of the color of your skin, that your potential may be limited. This is another profound loss of innocence for children of color, and it is an indoctrination into a world that seeks to deny one's full potential for the sake of preserving an immoral power structure. My awakening moment came when I was only 7 years old. My youngest daughter had hers when she was 4. Dr. King described this phenomenon this way in his letter from a Birmingham jail. It is difficult to wait when you suddenly find yourself tongue-twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she cannot go to the public amusement park. When you see the tears welling up in her little eyes, when you see that she is told that she cannot go to Fun World because Fun World does not accept little black and brown children. When you see little clouds distort her personality by unconsciously developing a bitterness towards society that tells her she is lesser than. When you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son asking in agonizing pathos, "Daddy, why do they treat us so bad?" That was in 1963, and people of color still find ourselves stammering, tongue-tied to find the words to explain the inexplicable racial inequality that still exists in the 21st century. We celebrate first, like Captain Remoshe Nelson and General Brown, not because they represent racial equality, but because they are a testament that the system that perpetuates inequality is not absolute in its subjugation. I submit to you that renaming 12 Army bases cannot, in and of itself, correct centuries-old moral travesties, but it could set the table for America to have a long overdue conversation in earnest on race that could lead to a nation on a path towards reconciliation and atonement. I started Citizens Against Intolerance the day following the mass murder of 9 black parishioners gunned down in Charleston, South Carolina's historic Mother Emanuel AME Church. A hateful man whose name I will not mention knocked on the door, was invited in to pray, and conducted Bible study for over an hour before producing a gun and systematically killing 9 parishioners. Reverend Clementa Pinckney, Reverend Sharonda Singleton, Reverend Daniel Simmons, Cynthia Hurd, Susie Jackson, Ethel Lance, Myra Thompson, DePayne Middleton Doctor, and Twanza Sanders. The murderer was found to have had pictures of symbols of the Confederacy. In his affidavit, he stated that he wanted to start a race war. His inspiration was the same racist ideology the 12 men who are the namesakes for 12 tax-funded Army bases who fought for the Confederacy. They share that same ideology. There are those who say you cannot legislate what is in someone's heart. To them I say we have not tried hard enough. To them I say legislating someone's heart is really not what this is all about. It's about the actions of people that must be legislated. When we formed Citizens Against Intolerance, we did so as a pushback against structural inequality and all forms of bias. Communities of color are tired of seeing our churches, synagogues, and mosques burned. We are tired of watching our judges and their families assassinated. My heart goes out to Judge Esther Salas and her family, who were the victims of an apparent hate crime less than a week ago. How long must we watch our sons and daughters' lives be destroyed by people filled with racial animus? How long must we endure the systematic oppression? My condolences go out to the family of Specialist Vanessa Guillen. The death of a child is something I hope no one ever has to experience. How long must we watch black athletes who speak truth to power be villainized? I submit to you that structural racial inequality is the defining issue in November's election. We have learned the lesson from the 2016 presidential election. As an old African proverb says, life is like a kindergarten teacher. If you do not learn today's lesson, she will gladly teach you tomorrow. That will not be necessary because in 2020, the people of good conscience are going to show up and show out at the ballot box. A month from now, another demonstration will be held to honor the 57th anniversary of the Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech and March on Washington. While I do not wish to steal their thunder, I will submit the following. 54 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, 53 years after the administration of the first black president, the United States is facing a profound period of backlash against the social, cultural, political, and economic promise of all of these events. The ascent of Donald Trump into the White House was in part fueled by the sentiment that someone believes they are losing their country. This is a very dangerous and misguided notion because it implies ownership. There is no one community or no one race of people who own the American brand. That brand has been forged in the blood, sweat, toil, and tears of all Americans from all communities, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, Latino, and of all genders and of all religious identities. When we deny this basic truth, we harm the sacrifices of those who have forged this brand in a most fundamentally profound manner. Now that our nation is fully awoke, we can never allow ourselves to be lulled back to sleep. So today I challenge everyone witnessing this rally to commit to bringing about the change we all want to see. Perhaps that means having a difficult conversation with a colleague, Perhaps that means reaching out to an old childhood friend that divisions society created has formed between us. Perhaps that means entertaining a political candidate that you might not otherwise consider, but who has a better grasp on the issue that is most pertinent in this election. And I say again, that is structural racial inequality. Perhaps that is voting for a candidate who knows how to make America work for all Americans. In closing, I will leave you with words from a great man taken from us at the age of 39 years old, Dr. Martin Luther King. I would submit to you that he was a saint among us. At the time of his assassination, he had a 25% approval rating, and that speaks to how we can look back in time and see the gross inequality of racial oppression, but we can't see it when it's right here in our face in the present moment. He said this: if the inexpressible cruelties of slavery could not stop us, then the opposition we face today will surely fail. We will win our freedom because the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of God are embodied in our echoing demands. Thank you. May God bless you and protect you and your families.
Ladies and gentlemen, for those seated, please stand for the benediction. I Have a Dream, a World by Langston Hughes. Let us pray. I dream of a world where man, no other man, will scorn, where love will bless the earth, and peace is past adorn. I dream of a world where all will know sweet freedom's way, where greed no longer saps the soul, nor avarice blights our day. A world I dream where black or white, whatever race you are, will share the bounties of the earth, and every man and woman is free. Where wretchedness will hang its head, and joy, like a pearl, attends the needs of all mankind. Of such I dream, my world. May peace and love be with you always. May peace be with you and your loved ones. Amen. Ladies and gentlemen, please make sure to vote for this November's election. And I challenge you to bring 2 friends. This concludes our rally today. Thank you for joining us. Stay safe and God bless.